So, good morning, everyone. This morning, I will be introducing our first speaker. So, to go ahead and get started with that, I will be introducing Dr. Rajan Chokshi. So, with almost 40 years of professional experience, both within and outside of the oil and gas industry, Dr. Rajan Chokshi has expertise in artificial lift, real-time production optimization, software development, and management. Chokshi has worked for national oil companies, major independents, service providers, and technological companies. He is currently engaged in projects related to artificial lift optimization, failure prediction, virtual flow metering, emissions reduction, and competency management. He has a few patents, several papers, and a multitude of industry presentations. He has been twice elected as an SPE Distinguished Lecturer and continues to volunteer on multiple SPE technical committees. Furthermore, he serves as a board member for the Artificial Lift Research Development Council. Dr. Chokshi holds a bachelor's and master's in chemical engineering from the Gujarat University and ITT Kanpur, India, and a PhD in petroleum engineering from the University of Tulsa. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Rajan Chokshi.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction. And I would also like to thank uh, organizers of the Permian Basin Knowledge Forum. Um, I hope that in next 40 or 45 minutes, you'll be able to sense that I feel very passionate about the topic, which is the artificial lift, because that is what I have been doing throughout my professional career. And some of you may have had exposure to artificial lift. And in that case, I would request you to ask some good, tough questions. And not that I'll have answers, but at least I'll become aware of some of the challenges that you might have come across. For those of you who are hearing about artificial lift for the first time, don't you worry. I got you covered also. This will be a rather brief and quick 40 minutes worldwide into artificial lift. I do teach a semester long curriculum at the graduate level. I have taught at both University of Houston as well as Texas Tech, besides a few other universities. So today's agenda, we will, as I said, I'll talk about artificial lift, what I call W4H: what, why, where, when, and how. So whenever you are launching into any topic, if you do this W4H, then you got it covered. Um, Next, we will look at what is a Permian Basin, what is its production profile, because what you will see is that artificial lift and production profile are closely linked. So we need to understand that. And then we will go into how artificial lifts are applied or what are the possibilities for the Permian Basin. I might, not I might, I will sprinkle in few case studies. And this is not representative of everything that is being done. Because as you will see during the presentation that the scope of activities in Permian Basin is very, very, very large, and my knowledge base is limited too. So I hope that this serves as an introduction for you to delve deeper if this topic is of interest to you. Okay, so with that, let's go into the artificial lift introductory. And we have to look at the life cycle of oil and gas well. By the way, artificial lift applies to both oil and gas well, even though most of our discussion today is centered around liquid dominating production. So when you look at the life cycle of a typical well, what you see is that after initial prep work and drilling completion is done, then you have relatively a flat plateau period which may last several years of naturally flowing, during which the production declines gradually but slowly, and then there is a sharp decline toward the later half. And typically, traditionally, companies have focused on artificial lift during this part of life cycle. And then, so artificial lift applies for majority of the life cycle of an oil and gas well. That is your takeaway number one. Now, this is conventional well. When you look at unconventional oil and gas life cycle, what we see is that plateau period, sorry, that plateau period is not as long. It could last few months to maybe a couple of years at most. So as soon as the naturally flowing phase is over, then you apply artificial lift to sustain the production. Now, if you look at the artificial lift distribution around the globe, by the way, these are all guesstimates because most of the companies do not publish this data. But the fact remains that nearly each and every oil and gas producing region rely on some form or some fashion of artificial lift. Oil wells and most gas wells, as I said earlier, will need artificial lift at some stage in their life cycle. Okay, a rough estimate in US, we have more than 90% of the oil producing wells on the artificial lift. And based on my informal surveys, more than 65 to 70% of the population of the wells worldwide is on artificial lift. Okay. Now, why do you need artificial lift system? Whether it's a green field or brown field, it's basically production acceleration, or in case of brown field, when you have tired production, you have reservoir pressure decline, water cut increases, which means you have to provide some additional boost. Okay. In case of infill drilling or EOR strategy change, also there will be some changes into the chemistry or the constitution, I should say, of the production, which necessitate the need for artificial lift system. So overall, if I have to say two words, then I would say production optimization. Production optimization of a producing oil or gas well relies heavily on artificial lift systems. Okay. When do you need artificial lift? If I have to give you a very simple explanation, we have two boundaries at the wellhead, at the reservoir, and then there are some differential pressures that needs to be overcome as the fluids traverse from reservoir all the way to the wellhead. So when do you need artificial lift? To bring the fluids to the surface when available reservoir energy is insufficient, meaning either the fluids do not flow or they flow in the quantities which are less than the desired quantity. This desired quantity thing would depend on what are your expectations or the operator's expectations on the rate of return, etc. So in short, when you require higher than natural flow quantities, that is when you must think of artificial lift. And these are the only expressions I am showing here. But if you take a small segment, a flow segment, then you can subdivide it into this kind of partial differential. Well, in this case, it's a differential equation whereby the total pressure loss over a small segment comprises of three elements: elevation, friction, and acceleration. And elevation mostly depends on the density and the deviation. Friction would depend on the velocity and the friction factor, as well as the diameter. And acceleration, for the most part, we ignore. And why do I talk about this? I talk about this because as you start thinking about artificial lift, you have to pay attention to, okay, what is the density? What is my well completion profile? What is the size of the tubular? These are the three main factors. Of course, you have to pay attention to the fluid characteristics like what is the API gravity, what is the water cut, which again end up coming into the density. Okay. So, by the way, there are many sophisticated software packages, and you might have used some of them available to size, design artificial lift. Now, what does artificial lift do? Here is again this line diagram, pressure versus depth. So one end of the boundary, as I said, is the reservoir pressure. Another end of the boundary is the wellhead pressure. As the fluids flows through the reservoir, when it comes into the wellbore, you have bottom hole flowing pressure, and then it needs to be high enough so that it can overcome flow resistance and then arrive at the surface. Now, at some point, what is going to happen? Your reservoir gets tired. You do not have sufficient bottom hole flowing pressure. In that case, this gray line, as it shows, the fluids do not flow to the surface. And you have to think of providing some kind of boost, or you have to provide what is called TDH, or the total dynamic head. And that's where this red box that I'm showing here, it's an artificial lift system. You have to lower some kind of artificial lift system, some equipment, some mechanism to provide this total dynamic head or boost. There are variety ways you can apply artificial lift. You can reduce the well head or line back pressure. That is easier said than done, because most of the time your wellhead pressures are dictated by what are your surface facilities. You can reduce the bottom hole or hydrostatic head pressure, or you can add energy using the pump from the surface. Now, you might have seen in the nodal analysis classes this inflow versus outflow and lift capability. So this inflow versus outflow is very, very important. If you do not know, then this orange red curve is the inflow curve, which represents what are the reservoir's capability as the drawdown or the pressure differential the across the reservoir changes, meaning this is the reservoir pressure. If the bottom hole flowing pressure is same as the reservoir pressure, then you do not have any flow rate, right? And if you have to produce higher flow rate, then you have to take larger pressure differential across the reservoir, or what is called larger drawdown. Now, this green curve is what is called outflow curve, which is the resistance presented by the surface facilities as well as the tubulars, wellhead tubulars. And again, this resistance varies with the flow rate. So whenever these two curves intersect, that is where you have what is called operating point or stable equilibrium. If you want to produce to the right of this operating point, then you have to provide some additional boost. And that is where artificial lift system comes into the play. That is your one takeaway from this inflow versus outflow. Now, what is going to happen oftentimes with the tired reservoirs, with increasing water cut and such, your outflow curve will shift. The earlier what you saw green curve is becoming now red curve. There is no intersection. Or as the reservoir capability declines, you can see that this orange curve, which was a reservoir inflow curve, shifts to the left. And in some cases, the shifts can be very dramatic and drastic. In like traditional conventional reservoir, this could have taken a years to shift like this, particularly when you have active water aquifer. In case of unconventional or tight reservoir, this shift can happen. This shift in the inflow curve can happen over matter of months, right, or weeks. So why am I bringing all of this up? Because when you are thinking about artificial lift, you have to think of this interplay between inflow and outflow, how your reservoir characteristics are changing, or how your tubular characteristics or the tubular behavior or tubular response is changing. Now, that brings us to this quick intro to different types of lift system. On the top left, you are seeing the rod lift, reciprocating rod lift, or sucker rod pumping, which is a kind of ubiquitous symbol of our industry, right? Now, that is not the only lift system. We have also progressing cavity pump system, as is shown in the second here, where my cursor is hovering. Then we have electrical submersible pump system. We have jet and piston pump. We have gas lift. We have plunger lift. We have foam injection, and there are variants, a few variants of this. But for practical purposes, if you remember these 8 forms, here I'm saying jet and piston pump as two different ones, right? If you remember these 8 forms, then you got your basis covered. Okay. So what you're looking at in this graphic here, or in this slide, is that there are different lift mechanisms and they work differently. Some have reciprocating motion, some have rotating motion, downhole, some have electrical centrifuge, and some do not have any pump like gas lift or plunger lift or foam injection. They do not have any pump. In case of gas lift, there is just gas being injected and you're lightening up the load. Remember density term earlier I showed? So My intent is not to make you all expert in different forms of artificial lift system. Just your takeaway is that there are a variety of ways to lift liquid. Okay, right? Now, you can classify the lift in variety in different buckets depending upon the source of energy. Like plunger lift, foam lift, and gas lift are primarily driven by available reservoir energy, whereas rod lift, piston lift, PCP, jet pump, and ESP, anything that has a pump in it, they require some kind of intervention in the valve bore. You lower some device that is energized from the surface. So everything on the right side of this partition that I have kept requires some sort of energy source at the surface to drive the pump downhole. Okay. All right. In terms of liquid production capacity, now remember, we do not think in terms of oil production. We think in terms of liquid production because we are primarily lifting liquids. So in terms of liquid production capacity, on the upper end of the spectrum, you have jet pump, ESP, and gas lift. On the lower end of the spectrum, you have plunger lift and foam lift. And middle of the road, you have piston pump, PCP, and rod lift. Now you say, okay, what is high, what is low, what is medium? If I had to give you a rough guideline, anything above a couple of thousand, 1,500 to 2,000 barrels per day type of production, I would call it high. Anything below 50 barrels per day, I would call it low. And somewhere between 50 and 1,500 is a medium. And there are artificial lift manufacturers who provide a range of equipment to cover different flow capacity. Now, one thing also you have to remember is that you will find a gas lift well that can produce as high as 10,000 plus barrels, and then there are gas lift wells that produce less than 10 barrels per day. Meaning the lift methods which are on the right side of the spectrum can be applied at times with a lot of difficulty on the lower end of the spectrum, but the lift on the left end of the spectrum cannot be applied on the upper end because of they've hit that physical limit, so to speak. Now you have seen a variety of lift system, you have seen variety of options and possibilities. And this becomes quite a challenging task if you are being asked to select or design a lift system. So there are few things you have to remember before you launch into that. One thing is that the valve production is highly dynamic and lift system requirement can occur at any time during valve's life cycle. Okay. Different type of lift system can be applied on a valve, on the same valve at different times, meaning you have to think dynamically. You have to keep eye on the valve production. And then another thing is that it is not you just sat and forget. Artificial lift systems efficiency and reliability changes over the time, meaning you have to be aware of making continuous adjustment for optimized operation so that you have the lowest cost of lifting. And that's why industry has devised this digital oil field approaches, which is not part of this presentation. Okay. And there are lots of machine learning algorithms being utilized to make sure that operators can track the lift system's efficiency and reliability. Okay, moving further on, lift technology application process. You start always by establishing the target production levels and condition. You have to understand the reservoir potential, you have to predict it, you have to figure out what are the reservoir and surface facility constraint. So all of this would be covered under reservoir analysis, valve analysis, and nodal analysis, right? So nodal analysis forms the basis of most of the design and analysis decisions you make for artificial lift. Then you have to remove the technically infeasible lift technology. For example, if you're looking at a well that is supposed to produce more than 1,000 barrels per day, you can say at the outset, hey, I'm not going to consider plunger lift or capillary injection. Okay, but still you'll have some 4 to 5 options. Then you think in terms of, okay, what is the support infrastructure I have available? What is the required performance criteria, over what range this lift system needs to operate. Meaning lift selection process requires some careful thoughts and consideration. After you have selected a specific lift, then you have to launch into the design process. Again, For design, you have multiple options. This is not the talk to talk about that. Just to make you aware that there are a variety of tools available in the market, and also all vendors, lift system vendors who provide assistance to the operators to design the equipment. Once you have done the design, then you go into economic evaluation, figure out what are going to be your installation, training cost, acquisition cost, operating cost, etc. Perform some risk analysis if that is what your stakeholders require. And finally, once you have lowered it, then you have to also think in terms of optimization. What type of optimization you have to perform at the well site, at the back office, or what I call desktop optimization, and then what type of collaborative practices you have to install. Again, I teach all of this over 1 week curriculum or a semester long curriculum. So this is not, but if you take this blueprint and what I discussed until now, you have covered most of your bases as far as the artificial lift at a very, very high level is concerned. Rest is all you trying to practice further. Now let's talk about Permian Basin. What you're looking at is a figure from EIA, which I downloaded yesterday. And what you're looking in the blue is US crude production from about 2007 until 2024. And what we are seeing is a hockey stick effect starting around 2010-11 timeframe when the unconventional started, such that now US is one of the world's, not one of the world's largest producer, because you're seeing here in yellow, Russia, another large producer that has been constantly producing around 10 million barrel per day. And then green is Saudi Arabia, that is also around 10 million barrels per day. Now, you look at all these global numbers, and where does Permian sit in these global numbers? You see, around 2009 or so, here the number is less than 500,000, I would say. And boom, 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 boom. Here, look what happens in 2015, 16, or maybe around 2014, it started, the unconventional tight oil revolution started, whereby now Permian is producing more than 5.4 million, or more than 6 million barrels of liquids or oil, I should say, per day. If Permian was sitting in a separate country, then it would rank number 4 in the production. As you can see, that is the importance of the production coming out of the Permian Basin. Now, if you look within the US, Permian is producing more than 47, 48% of the oil produced in the US, right? And relatively, if you see Eagle in blue here, Bakken in yellow, then Appalachia is here, and Haynesville. And what we are seeing is that the Permian story started unfolding 2014, even though this Permian is around for over 100 years, right? It was mostly conventional. 2010 is when things started changing, and we are beginning to see the unconventional production. And here are some more numbers, monthly tight oil. When you look at the geography of the Permian Basin, it is staggering in size. You have almost 86,000 square miles covering 2 states, Texas and New Mexico, more than 7,000 fields, and there are 55 counties in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. So you can see the not only scope of the Permian, but also the scope of the production profile across. And that is where the artificial lift choices becomes very, very interesting. And here, if you are interested in this type of stats, then these are the top 10 operators. Exxon is up there because of that acquisition of Pioneer. And these are not just the 10 operators. We are talking about hundreds of operators in Permian Basin. Some of them are producing as little as less than 10,000 barrels per day. And here, as you can see, Exxon is almost producing 750,000 barrels of oil per day as of December 2024. So each and every one of this operator, whether you're producing less than 10,000 barrels or almost 700,000, you will need an artificial lift, right? And that brings us to the artificial lift in Permian Basin. You remember seeing this graphic that is in the bottom right corner, and that tells you how we have a plethora of options in terms of artificial lift when you think purely in terms of liquid production. But that is not the only parameter. You have to also think about the production challenges coming specifically to Permian. Before 2009, 2010, it was mostly conventional production. It was a tired production, and it was mostly ESP and rod lift. We were lifting nothing but water, practically, more than 90% water cut type of. And there was active CO2 injection, water injection going on in Permian. Come the unconventional revolution. And now what we are seeing, we have well depths going up to 8,400, 10,000 feet TVD. One of the deepest one I saw was 17,000 feet TVD, true vertical depth. And average lateral lengths are creeping up. It started at a couple of thousand feet lateral length, and now 10,000 feet is fairly common, which is about 2 mile long lateral. So you're going 7,000 feet and then to, so it's a very, very deep, long slanter well geometry. Another thing you have to think of it is that this lateral is a kind of a separator, okay? Meaning we have quite transient, mixed phase, sluggy, and turbulent flow that is happening in this well when you compare to the production coming from the conventional well because of the ultra low permeability and stimulated reservoir volume that we generate with fracturing and whatnot, you are going to see that there are high initial rate followed by steep and rapid production decline. Each and every well that is in the tight formation or shale type of production, you are going to have this production characteristic. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Another thing we have seen is the increasing gas oil ratio, sand, paraffin, scale corrosion, and then the power supply. These are the production challenges. Why we have to talk about production challenges? Because that is what drives the selection of artificial lift. And what you are seeing here, what I was mentioning earlier, in case of unconventional production, it's not only Permian story, by the way. Any basin in the world that has unconventional or tight production, you're going to see when as soon as the well is fractured and then put on the production after fracture fluid recovery, what you're seeing is that there is a sharp spike. And then in the early days of unconventional production, it was not uncommon to find almost 60 to 70% drop in the production in the very first year of the production. Nowadays, of course, with the better like identification of the prime asset to uh, drill, also better identification of source rock, also better fracturing practices and more longer laterals, what we are seeing, and also better choke management practices at the surface. What we are seeing is that some of these wells are able to maintain or sustain behavior like conventional well, whereby you have natural flow possibilities at significantly higher rates for maybe a year, or even in some cases 2 years. But the fact remains that there is a phase where you have early production and then the production declines where there is a late production. So looking at it from the artificial lift engineer's perspective, you have to think of an artificial lift system that can handle widely varying production rate. And it's not only production rate, the phase is also widely varying. Think of it this way. Initial phase, fracturing fluid recovery, there are lots of proppants coming back. You have solids coming back, right? And as the well settles down, you have not only high liquid rate, but also sometimes lots of water coming. It could be fracturing fluid, or it could be the condensate water coming in. Then, as the production starts going down, what happens? As the pressure goes below the bubble point pressure, the gas starts separating in the lateral. And then you are going to have not only higher gas content, but it will be highly turbulent gas bubbles followed by liquid slugs. So there are lots of challenges. Not only we have pressure maintenance, but lift systems are also limited because most of the pumping systems, they assume that the liquid coming into the pump body would be fairly homogenized with less amount of gas. Okay. So when you again going back to what are the artificial lift choices during the early production phase? Early production, higher rates, some solids coming back, and not as much of gas. In that case, you can think of jet pump, um, and because jet pump is frequently used for fracturing fluid recovery phases. Traditionally, it is used for that. Then you can think of gas lift and ESP. Foam lift is only applicable when you have gas dominated production. Otherwise, for liquid dominated production, it is gas lift, ESP, and jet pump. PCPs cannot be applied because of true vertical depth limitation. CO2 and aromatic gases can also be. Plus, they have limitation in terms of the production. So, ESP manufacturers had lots of problem to handle this significant decline, and that's where they have come up with a new generation ESPs that can handle wide range, meaning a pump can start at 2000 barrels and go all the way up to 500 barrels. Okay. So that because from the operator side, what you want is a device that stays in the well much longer. Otherwise, you may have to call the workover rig. And that intervention, not only you are losing production, but also it costs you money. Plus, you have to get new equipment. So this is one of the wish list of the operators that give us a system that will stay there longer. Here is one case study from ConocoPhillips that what they are doing in Permian, right? By the way, this is their lift type selection across the globe, whether it's a Permian, China, Norway, Alaska, or Canada. And what we are seeing in the Permian, which is in this blue bar that I'm hovering over right now, so they are using rod lift, followed by gas lift, followed by ESP. These are the three main methods in um, Permian that they were using. And that is for typically low GLR wells and high productivity wells. They used annular flow gas lift. And here is, this is a somewhat complicated graph, and we do not have enough time for me to go over it. Your takeaway from this is that ConocoPhillips has focused more on the gas lift application, followed by rod lift, okay, towards the later part of the life, right? But earlier part, they are using tubular flow, of annular flow followed by tubular flow, and then they could use some different type. Here is another graphic from an SP paper. What they are showing is that how they use hydraulic jet pump in place of ESP in to lift the fluid. But look at the amount of fluid that was being lifted, about 300 barrels of oil, and maybe this is a gas, 250 MCF per day of gas. So jet pump has been used. So we talked about ESP, we talked about gas lift, we talked about jet pump in the earlier part. Now let's talk about mid to late life production. As I said, mid to late life production, you have lower production rates. In that case, your choices are typically rod lift, piston pump, then there are varieties of plunger lift, gas lift combinations, and then jet pump. Now, most of the operators in the Permian, once the production declines, they go towards rod lift because rod lift has a significant knowledge base. There is a significant familiarity with rod lift amongst the field operators and the field hands. So rod lift continues to be preferred mode once you have production less than 500 barrels. Some people may take me to the task and they may challenge me that, okay, maybe we can even go below, I mean, higher than 500 barrels per day production. But my estimate is typically it's preferable to switch to rod lift once you go below 200 or so. Okay. Um, Here is another case study from Occidental. And this is somewhat dated from 2017, but at that time, their chief production technologist, Shona Noonan, said that this is how they were envisaging how the life of well will progress in Permian. And that happened because they had significant number of failures with the rod lift, with ESPs. So they said, okay, we'll start with annular gas lift, then we will move over to conventional gas lift, then we'll go to intermittent gas lift, then we'll go to what is people call GAPL or gas assisted plunger lift, and then to the chamber lift. Okay. Um, so this brings me to the last couple of slides, and I'm intentionally keeping up to 15 to 20 minutes for question and answers. I see there is some activity going on in the chat box, but be thinking about your questions and feel free to ask me to go back. Now, what are your main takeaways from this about 35 minutes of the presentation that I have given so far? One, artificial lift systems are ubiquitous in oil and gas fields because the lift system requirement can occur at any time during each and every well's life cycle. There are a variety of lift systems. We looked at ESP, we looked at PCP, we looked at gas lift, rod lift, jet pump, piston pump, plunger lift, foam lift. And then there are some combinations of them also. So there is a plethora of options, but not all the lift options will be applicable for each well or even a well type. Oftentimes, when I'm teaching this class, people say, tell me this type of well, what type of lift? And I said, it depends. I have to look at a variety of things. And what do you look at? You look at what is the depth, what is the production rate, as I said earlier, what is the tubing size, what are the surface constraint, whether you have electricity available at the site or not, whether you have sufficient gas available or not, and then what is the knowledge of amongst your people? Do you have to train them into new lift system? So these are the things that dictate the lift choices a lot more than the economics. Of course, economics is important, don't get me wrong, but these are the things that you have to look at first. So typically lift selection goes in stages. As I showed in the previous slide, you eliminate like 4 or 5 out of 8 choices, and then you focus on 3, and then you go into deeper dive. Another thing to remember is that most of the time, you cannot just set it and forget it. You can apply different type of lift system on a well at different times. Even with the same lift type, you may have to change the equipment. You may have to change, like for example, in case of ESP, you may have to go to the pump of a different capacity, typically lower capacity, as the production gets tired. In case of gas lift, you may have to change the depth of the injection valve, you may have to change the injection rate, etc. Another very, very important consideration is that lift systems efficiency and reliability changes with time. You have to be prepared to make continuous adjustment to ensure operations which are optimum, to ensure that you have the lowest lease operating cost. Remember, we are not in the business of just producing oil. We are in the business of producing oil and gas in the most profitable manner. And what is it? Meaning you do not want your well to fail because your lift system has failed, because you have cost related to non-productive time. When the well is down, it is not producing. You have costs related to changeover. You have costs related to workover. So there are lots of things. And that's why companies invest heavily on the digital oil field approaches, like they put in sensors out there, then they put some SCADA systems, and more people are putting some controllers out there. They also look at some of the machine learning approaches nowadays increasingly. Coming back specifically to Permian, most all oil producers in the Permian relies on artificial lift for profitable asset operation. At times, the decision to put an artificial lift earlier part of the well's life cycle, even though well may be producing on its own on the reservoir energy, let's say 1,000 barrels, but because you want your return on investment higher, you want to produce 2,000 barrels per day because your investors are saying that, hey, look, we need our money upfront faster. So then you say, okay, I'm going to put an ESP which will boost up the production to 2000, or I'll put in gas lift or annular gas lift or whatever. So most all producers, in my experience, they go for a lift related decision very early part of the life cycle. Some of them even go from day one. Coming back to Permian, ESP and gas lift are preferred life forms during early to mid stage of life cycle for tight wells. And when I say early to mid stage again, I would put demarcation for ESP around 1000 barrels or so, or maybe 500 barrels. For gas lift, it could go as low as almost less than 10 because there are variations of gas lift that I mentioned: annular, continuous, which is tubular. Then there is a gapple, then there's a paggle, then there's a chamber lift, intermittent lift. So gas lift is that, from that consideration, it has a broad range of applicability. Rod pumping is considered to be a preferred method for mid to late life cycle. And then also there are, as I said, different forms of gas lift. So these are your main takeaways, and that's why I'm spending a lot more time on this slide. And one picture, if you remember, this is showing you what are potential artificial lift life cycle in tight and unconventional reservoir. You can start with the jet pump or ESP or annular gas lift. After a while, you switch over to tubular gas lift. Then you think of continuous plunger assisted gas lift, which is called PAGL. Then you think of intermittent plunger lift or gas assisted plunger lift, or intermittent gas lift and chamber lift, or you think of rod pump. As the production profile changes, and here we are looking at production profile in terms of flow rates, but you also have to look at in terms of gas oil ratio, in terms of water cut. You at times you have to also look at some scaling tendencies, some paraffinic issues, paraffin related issues, some ferrous sulfide scales, etc. And your artificial lift system choices get impacted by each of these production parameters. I believe that brings us to the end of this presentation. We are at about 10:45 or so on the clock. So we are ready to take some questions. Um, how do
Yes, sir.
we do that, Ryan, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the great presentation. We have about 5 minutes left until this link closes, so I'm going to ask about a question or two, and then I'll go ahead and close it out for everybody.
Oh,
So,
okay.
for the first question, somebody asked, given the increasing focus on gas lift in the Permian, what are the key challenges in maintaining injection efficiency and avoiding liquid loading?
Okay. So the challenges actually they are multifold. It starts always with, do you have sufficient gas or not? Do you have sufficient compression capacity or not? Assuming that you have taken care of these challenges, then the third one, which is critical, is that are you staying on the bottommost mandrel, which is like in case of gas lift, to maintain the higher efficiency, you have to inject at the deepest point. Meaning the problem is that sometime if you cannot stay the DPS, then you will have suboptimal production. You mentioned some liquid loading issues. Yes, liquid loading may happen if your DPS mandrel is not reached or DPS mandrel is at much higher location than where it needs to be. Sometime end of the tubing decisions also could be relevant to this issue of liquid loading. It's an excellent question. Next one, please.
Awesome. So another question is, in the Permian Basin, where reservoir pressures can vary significantly, how do petroleum engineers like yourself determine the most suitable artificial lift method for a well, considering factors such as well depth, fluid properties, gas content, and economic feasibility?
Okay. I think when I gave you a bird's eye view of what are the current choices in Permian and what are the current choices in my experience that people have experienced, um, that is what is applicable. I suppose that answers your question, meaning As you go deeper and deeper, ESP provides a much better option. So does annular gas lift earlier part of the life cycle. As the reservoir productivity declines, then you have to think strategically, okay, I need to switch over. Is my ESP too large? If it is too large, then it is tend to failure. It needs to be right size. And this is one area of a challenge that people often face. Exactly when do you switch over from one to another lift form? We have answer to almost all types of production related question in terms of the lift choices. It is just whether you can afford to switch over when it is ideal or not. Okay, next one, please.
Okay, and I think this one will be the last question for the session. It says, when using artificial lift systems on a single well, will there be negative impacts on a reservoir, like changes in the fluid properties or just any kind of damage you could think of?
Okay. So, and this happened in the earlier part of unconventional, where sometime if you, in order to recover fluids faster, you can create a significantly large drawdown. And that may lead to, like, if your propons are not properly settled, your stimulated reservoir may not have properly formed, and then the propons start flowing back because you have introduced a significantly large drawdown, which causes very high velocities in the reservoir, right? So that is one challenge that people have often experienced in applying artificial lift, and that's where the choke management aspect comes in. And we have gotten a lot better at this. I still remember several years ago, somebody came and told me that, hey, your lift systems are causing uh, my propons to break and my fractures to again reseal. So that is one challenge in unconventional. In conventional, again, depending upon the type of the reservoir, if you draw down too fast, too quick, you might leave the oil behind in the reservoir. So that is where you have to work with the reservoir team. What are the allowables, and accordingly size the lift system and operate it accordingly. Hope that
Awesome.
answers.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Chokshi. And I'm pretty sure everybody was able to at least take one or maybe even a couple things away from this presentation. And with that, I want to go ahead and remind everybody that's in the Zoom link that we have another presenter starting here at 11, Mr. John Howard. If y'all are all more than welcome to join that one as well. And once again, thank you, Dr. Chowsky, for your time, and
Thank you so
thank you for
much.
coming out to give this presentation.
I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Yes, sir. You too.